The dining room of the Azure Peak was always filled with a kind of quiet noise. It wasn't loud, like a busy street or a school cafeteria. It was the sound of money. It was the clinking of heavy silver forks against fine china plates. It was the low, soft murmuring of voices that were used to getting whatever they wanted. The air smelled like expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and butter sauce. It was a world that felt very far away from the dusty, noisy streets where the buses ran. But for Julie, this was her reality every night. Julie moved through the tables like a ghost. That was how she liked it. She wore a crisp white shirt that was starched so stiff it could almost stand up on its own, and a long black skirt that brushed against her ankles. Her hair was pulled back tight into a bun that pulled at her scalp, but she didn't mind. It was part of the uniform. It was part of the job. In her hand, she carried a heavy silver tray loaded with plates of delicate food. Her arms didn't shake, even though the tray felt heavier with every step. She had been doing this for 3 years, and her muscles knew exactly how to balance the weight. She arrived at table. Fran lowered the tray silently to the stand next to her. The man sitting there was talking on a phone he held to his ear, ignoring the woman across from him who was cutting a piece of steak. He didn't look at Julie. She set the plate down gently, not making a sound. She placed the napkin exactly where it belonged. She didn't interrupt their conversation. She didn't smile too much, and she didn't frown. She just served. That was what she was paid to do. To them, she was just part of the furniture. She was the person who brought the water and took away the empty glasses. They didn't know her name, and they didn't want to. She was invisible, but Julie wasn't really invisible. She was watching everything. As she turned away from the table and headed back toward the kitchen, her eyes drifted across the room. She passed under the glowing crystal chandeliers that cast warm light on the velvet chairs. And there, in the center of the room, bathed in a spotlight of its own, was the piano. It was a stunning instrument. It was a grand piano, black and shiny enough to reflect the images of the people walking by. The lid was propped open, showing off the gold strings inside. It looked perfect. It looked dangerous every night Julie walked past that piano. Every night it called to her. She tried to ignore it, but it was like a magnet. She would slow her steps just a little as she passed the polished mahogany curve. She would stare at the keys. 88 black and white ivories waiting to be touched. For most of the customers at the Azure Peak, the piano was just decoration. It was a status symbol, something to make the room look fancy. The restaurant usually hired a trio of violinists to play soft music in the corner, or they played a recorded playlist of smooth jazz. The piano sat there, silent and empty, gathering nothing but admiring glances and fingerprints that the polished wiped away every morning to Julie. It was something else entirely. It was a locked door that she had lost the key to. She remembered the way her mother's hands looked when she played. Julie remembered sitting on the bench next to her when she was very small, her feet dangling in the air. Her mother would play fast, happy songs that made Julie want to dance, and then slow, sad songs that made her want to cry. Her mother had told her that music was the only way to talk when you didn't have the words. Her mother had a gift. She could make the instrument sing, and for a while Julie could too. She had practiced for hours every day after school. She learned to read the notes like they were a storybook. But life doesn't always follow the script you write for it. When Julie was 16, things got hard at home. Money ran out. There were bills that couldn't be paid. Her mother got sick and couldn't work. The music had to stop. The piano they had was an old upright one that had seen better days, but eventually even that had to be sold. Julie remembered the day the movers came. She remembered the empty space in the living room where the piano used to be. It felt like a hole in her heart. She promised herself she would play again someday. But someday is a tricky word. It gets pushed back by bills, by rent, by shifts that start early and end late. Now, at 22, Julie hadn't touched a keyboard in 6 years. Her fingers were rough from handling trays and scrubbing counters, calloused from hard work. She felt like the music inside her had dried up. Julie walked into the kitchen through the swinging doors. The noise hit her like a wall. Chefs were shouting orders, pots were clanging, and the smell of roasted garlic and spices was thick in the hot air. She placed her dirty dishes in the bin and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. She had 10 minutes before she had to go back out. She leaned against the stainless steel counter and closed her eyes for a second. She flexed her fingers. They felt stiff. Sometimes, late at night, when she was alone in her small apartment, she would lay her hands on her table or on her knee and tap out a rhythm. It was a habit she couldn't break. Her fingers remembered the songs even when her brain told her to forget. "Julie, table 7 needs water," the head waiter called out. She opened her eyes and nodded. "On it," she said. She grabbed a water pitcher and headed back out into the quiet luxury of the dining room. As she walked, she passed a large mirror on the wall. She caught a glimpse of herself. She looked tired. The black uniform made her look plain. She wondered if the customers could see the dream she used to have, or if they just saw a tired girl carrying water. She reached table 7 and poured the water carefully. The people there were laughing about something, glasses of red wine in their hands. They didn't notice her. She was just the water girl. She turned to leave, but her path took her right by the piano again. It was late in the evening now. The restaurant was starting to clear out. The violinists had packed up their instruments and left for the night. The room was quieter. The spotlight on the piano made the black surface gleam like a dark pool of water. Julie stopped. She shouldn't stop. She had work to do. But her feet felt like they were stuck to the plush carpet. She looked around. The maître d' was at the front desk, talking on the phone. The other waiters were busy in the corners. She took a small step closer to the instrument. She could smell the lemon polish they used on the wood. It was a clean, sharp smell. She looked at the keys. They were so close. If she just reached out her hand, she could touch them. But fear grabbed her. She felt a tightness in her chest. Who was she kidding? She wasn't a concert pianist. She was a waitress. Her hands were made for carrying trays, not for playing music. Her mother would have been sad to see Julie just walking past the piano every night. Too scared to play, Julie looked at her reflection in the shiny black side of the piano. She saw the uniform. She saw the tired eyes. But then, for just a second, she imagined herself sitting on the bench. She imagined the feel of the cool keys under her fingertips. She imagined the sound filling the room, not just background noise, but a real sound that would make people stop talking and listen. It was a crazy thought. It was a dangerous thought. If she played, she might be fired. If she played, she might be terrible. Or worse, she might be good. And then she would know exactly what she had lost. A customer walked past her to get to the restroom. Bumping her shoulder slightly. "Sorry," the man muttered. Not looking at her. "No problem," Julie whispered. She stepped back, pulling her hands into her apron pockets. She walked away from the piano, toward the safety of the kitchen. But even as she walked, her fingers were moving inside her pockets, tapping a silent rhythm against the rough fabric. The night was almost over. Soon the lights would dim and the cleaning crew would come. But for Julie, the night felt unfinished. The piano stood behind her, silent and waiting, holding a secret that she'd been carrying for too long. She didn't know it yet, but tonight was going to be different. Tonight, the invisible girl was going to have to step into the light. The evening had started like any other, but the air in the dining room felt heavier tonight. Maybe it was the storm front brewing miles away that made the pressure in the room drop, even if the rain wasn't falling yet. Or maybe it was just one of those nights where everything felt like a struggle. For Julie, the shift was turning into a marathon of patience. She weaved through the tables, her arms loaded with a heavy tray carrying 3 main courses. The special tonight was a pan-seared sea bass with a delicate lemon butter sauce. It was expensive, fragile, and the kitchen had made her wait 10 minutes for it, which meant table 12 was going to be unhappy. When she reached the table, the man sitting there checked his expensive watch and sighed loudly. He didn't have to say anything. The sigh said it all. He was hungry, he was important, and he was tired of waiting. "I am so sorry for the delay, sir," Julie said, her voice steady and low. She placed the plates down with extreme care, trying not to let her tiredness show. "The kitchen is preparing a complimentary dessert for you as a small apology for the wait." The man looked at the fish, then up at her. He didn't smile. He just picked up his fork and nodded once, a sharp, quick movement that dismissed her. Julie took a breath, held it for a second, and let it out slowly. She turned on her heel and headed back toward the safety of the service station. Behind her, she heard the woman at the table complain that the fish was slightly cooler than she liked. Julie kept walking. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. She engaged with every complaint tonight, she would crumble. Back at the station, she leaned against the wall and rubbed her feet. She had been on her feet for 7 hours. Her shoes were sensible and black, designed to be non-slip, but they weren't magic. Her arches throbbed with a dull ache that traveled up her calves. She felt a sharp pain in her lower back, a familiar reminder that she wasn't as young as she used to be. Even though she was only 20-2, she looked around the small area where the waitstaff gathered. Her coworker, a guy named Tom, who was always full of energy, was counting his tips. He was smiling. He had a table of tourists who tipped 20%. Tom asked, noticing Julie leaning against the wall with her eyes closed. "Table 12, Julie said simply, "and my feet are killing me." Nodded. "Hang in there. Only 2 more hours? Then we can get out of here." 2 hours. It felt like a lifetime. Julie nodded at him and pushed herself off the wall. She grabbed a cloth to polish some silverware, just to look busy, but her mind was drifting. The dining room was settling down. The early rush was over. The families with loud children had left, and now the room was filling with a different crowd, the late-night drinkers. The couples on romantic dates who stayed long after their food was gone. The lights were dimmed slightly, making the crystal glasses sparkle and the shadows in the corners grow deeper. The manager, a tall man with a tired face, named Mr. Henderson, walked by. He looked at his clipboard, then at Julie. "You can take your break now, Julie. 30 minutes. There's some leftover pasta in the back if you're hungry." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said. A break. 30 minutes of freedom. Usually, Julie would go to the small break room in the basement. It was windowless and smelled like cleaning supplies, but it had a couch. Or she would go out the back exit into the alleyway to get some fresh air. Although the alleyway smelled like garbage and old grease, she walked toward the back, but something stopped her. She didn't turn left toward the stairs. She kept walking straight, out of the service station, and into the main dining room. The music had stopped. The violinists packed up their instruments an hour ago. Now, the only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerators from the kitchen, the soft clinking of glasses, and the murmur of quiet conversations. The room felt vast and empty in a way it didn't. When it was crowded, Julie found herself standing near the center of the room again. It was a habit she couldn't break, like a moth drawn to a flame. She was drawn to the piano. She looked around to make sure no one was watching her closely. Mr. Henderson was in his office. The busboys were clearing tables in the far corner, laughing quietly about a joke she couldn't hear. The few remaining customers were engrossed in their own worlds. She walked slowly up to the instrument. It was magnificent. Up close, she could see the tiny reflections of the ceiling lights in the glossy black finish. She could see the grains in the wood veneer. It looked perfect. It looked expensive. It looked like something that belonged in a museum. It's not in a restaurant where people spilled red wine. Julie stood there, just looking at it. She felt a strange mix of emotions. There was awe, certainly. This piano was worth more than everything she owned put together. But there was also a deep, aching sadness. It was a physical pain in her chest, right behind her ribs. She thought about the old upright piano her mother used to play. It had scratches on the legs, and some of the keys stuck when the humidity was high. But when her mother played, it sounded like the most beautiful instrument in the world. It sounded like home. This piano in front of her didn't sound like home. It sounded like a dream. Julie reached out a hand. She didn't touch the keys yet. She just let her hand hover over the smooth wood of the lid. She felt the heat radiating from the instrument, as if it was alive. Waiting for her, she remembered the promise she made to herself years ago. Sitting in the empty living room after the movers took their piano away, she promised she wouldn't give up on music. But life had a way of making you break promises you didn't want to break. Bills had to be paid. Rent was due every month. There wasn't time for lessons. There wasn't money for a keyboard, so the music stayed inside her head. It bounced around in her skull, melodies that she made up while she was walking to the grocery store, harmonies that she hummed while she was scrubbing the floor, but she never let them out. She was scared that if she let them out, they wouldn't be as good as she remembered. She was scared that she had lost her talent. She looked at her hands. They were rough. The skin on her fingertips was hard from years of work. She had small burns on her wrist from a kitchen accident last month. Her knuckles were red from the harsh soap they used at the restaurant. These were not the hands of a pianist. These were the hands of a worker. "Look at you," she whispered to herself. "Standing here like a fool?" She pulled her hand back and hugged it to her chest. She felt a sudden urge to cry, which was stupid. She didn't cry over pianos. She didn't cry over things she couldn't have. She was strong. She had survived when things got tough. She was working, she was independent, and she was okay. But she wasn't okay. Not really. She was hollow. A loud laugh came from the bar area, breaking her trance. Julie flinched. She realized she had been standing there, staring at the piano for almost 5 minutes. Anyone could have seen her. She looked like she was sleepwalking or confused. She took a step back, shaking her head to clear her thoughts. "Get it together, Julie," she muttered under her breath. "You have a job to do." She turned to walk away, to go to the break room and eat the cold pasta, or maybe just splash some cold water on her face. She needed to wake up from this daydream, but she only took one step before she stopped again. It was the silence. The restaurant was so quiet. The piano was sitting there, open and waiting. It felt like it was calling her name. It felt like if she walked away now, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Not because she was going to become a famous star, but because she needed to know. She needed to know if the music was still inside her, or if it had died along with her old life. She checked the room one last time. The coast was clear. The piano was just a few feet away. Julie took a deep breath. She let go of her apron and let her arms hang loose at her sides. She stepped closer. The piano seemed to grow larger as she approached it, looming over her. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a challenge. She stood right in front of the bench. It was velvet-covered and looked inviting. She didn't sit down, not yet. She just leaned forward, bringing her face close to the strings. She could smell the dust and the wood. It smelled like history. She lifted her right hand. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, but from nervous energy. She was terrified. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears like a drum beating a warning rhythm. "What are you doing?" she asked herself, but she didn't have an answer. She just knew that she couldn't walk away. Not tonight. Tonight, the weight of the silence was too heavy to carry. She needed a sound. She needed one single note to break the quiet. She lowered her hand. Her fingers were inches away from the keys. This was the moment. The point of no return. If she touched it, there was no going back to being just the invisible waitress. She would be someone who reached for something she couldn't have. She closed her eyes for a second, imagining her mother sitting next to her, guiding her hand. "Just one touch," she whispered, "just to feel it." And then she let her hand drop. Her fingertips made contact with the cool ivory of the F-sharp key. She didn't press it down. She just rested her fingers there, feeling the smoothness, the coldness, the reality of it under her skin. The connection was electric, shooting a jolt of something through her arm that she hadn't felt in years. It was a feeling of belonging. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the fall. The silence in the room felt heavy, like a thick blanket that had been thrown over everything. Julie stood perfectly still, her right hand resting on the white key of the grand piano. She wasn't pushing it down. She was just letting her fingers feel the cool, smooth surface. It felt solid, real. It felt colder than she expected, sending a small chill up her arm, but her hand was warm against the ivory. For a long moment, she didn't breathe. She just listened. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant traffic noise from the street outside, and the quiet breathing of the restaurant itself. She was waiting for someone to shout at her. She was waiting for Mr. Henderson to storm out of his office and tell her to get away from the expensive furniture. She was waiting for a customer to laugh and point, but nobody came. The room stayed quiet. Julie opened her eyes and looked at her hand. It looked small against the massive black body of the piano. Her fingers were rough, the skin a bit red from washing dishes and carrying hot trays. There was a small scar on her thumb from a cooking accident months ago. These weren't the hands of a lady who sat in a parlor and played Mozart. These were workers' hands. A wave of doubt washed over her. Who was she kidding? She was a waitress. She was the girl who brought the water and cleared the dirty napkins. She didn't belong here, hovering over an instrument that cost more than her parents' car. If she played, it would probably sound terrible. She was out of practice. She was rusty. The music in her head was beautiful, but what if her hands couldn't make it real? What if the sound that came out was awkward and ugly? She started to pull her hand back. The fear was too strong. It was easier to walk away. It was safer to go back to the break room, eat her cold pasta, and just survive the shift. At least that way, she wouldn't embarrass herself. But then, she stopped. Her father's voice popped into her head, clear as a bell. It was a memory from when she was a little girl, sitting at the old, scratched piano they used to have. She had been frustrated, hitting the wrong keys, tears running down her face, because she couldn't get the song right. Her father had knelt down beside her. He hadn't been angry. He had just smiled his gentle smile and said, "Music isn't about being perfect, kiddo. It's about being brave enough to let the sound out. If you hold it in, it dies. If you hold it in, it dies." Julie looked at the strings inside the piano, gleaming gold in the dim light. She realized she had been holding it in for 6 years. She had been walking around with a song inside her, trapping it, letting it die a little bit every day. She was tired of being quiet. She was tired of being invisible. "I'm not a ghost," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm still here." She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air that smelled of lemon polish and old wood. She closed her eyes again to shut out the luxury of the restaurant. She needed to forget about the velvet chairs and the crystal glasses. She needed to pretend she was back in her living room. She needed to pretend she was playing for her dad. She curled her fingers slightly. The position felt familiar, like shaking hands with an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Her thumb found the white key just to the left of her pinky. It was a C chord. The simplest chord in the world. She pressed down. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't a crash. It was a single, clear, resonant note that hummed in the air. It seemed to hang there, suspended in the silence, glowing like a small light. Then she added her middle finger on the E. Another note joined the first. Then her thumb on the G, a third note. C major, a happy, open sound. The piano sang. It was a deep, rich sound, much better than the old upright she used to play. The strings vibrated against the wood, creating a tone that was full and warm. It filled the space around her instantly. Julie's eyes snapped open. She looked at the keys, expecting them to have changed, expecting the magic to vanish. But they were just keys, and the sound was just sound. But it felt like a thunderclap to her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud and fast. Thump, thump. She froze, her hand hovering over the keys. She waited for the shouting. She waited for the angry manager, but the room just absorbed the sound. The notes faded away slowly, echoing softly off the high ceiling until they disappeared into the velvet drapes. Julie looked over her shoulder. The busboys were still in the corner, but their backs were turned. The couple by the window was looking at the menu. No one had noticed. It was just a few chords. To them, it might have just been a noise, a mistake, someone bumping into the piano. But to Julie, it was an earthquake. She looked back at the keyboard. Her hand was still shaking, but now it was shaking with excitement, not just fear. She had done it. She had touched it. She had made a sound. And the world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen down. She was still standing there in her black uniform, but she felt different. She felt taller. She moved her left hand toward the keys now. It felt clumsy. Her fingers felt stiff, like they were rusted shut. She tried to move them independently, to make them do what her brain was telling them, but they resisted. It was frustrating. She remembered how easy it used to be, how her fingers would dance across the keys like they had their own brains. Now they felt heavy and slow. She didn't let that stop her. She wasn't trying to play a concert. She wasn't trying to impress the critics. She was just trying to speak. She placed her left hand on the lower keys. Finding a bass note 10F, she pressed down. The low sound rumbled through the floorboards, vibrating up through her shoes. It felt powerful. She pressed down again on the right hand, the C major chord. 1, 2, 3, 4. She began to play a simple rhythm. It wasn't a famous song. It was just a child's melody, something she had learned when she was 5 years old. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. It felt silly to play such a simple song on such a magnificent instrument, but it was the only thing she could remember fully. The notes were there, buried under the dust and the worry of the last 6 years. Do, do, sol, sol, la, la, sol. As she played the simple melody, she felt a tightness in her chest begin to loosen. It was like a knot being untangled, strand by strand. The repetition of the notes was comforting. It was safe. She closed her eyes again and let her fingers find the next note without looking. She missed one. Her pinky hit in a sharp instead of an A. The sound clashed. It was wrong. It sounded bad. Julie flinched. The ugly note rang out, harsh and jarring. She pulled her hands back into her lap, as if she had been burned. That's it, she thought, her face flushing hot with embarrassment. You're done. You're not a pianist anymore. You're just a waitress making noise. She looked around, panic rising in her throat. Surely someone heard that mistake. Surely someone was laughing, but the room was still calm. The music from the simple tune had drifted through the air, light and quiet, and even the wrong note didn't seem to bother anyone. The couple by the window had stopped talking for a second, but now they were whispering to each other, smiling. Julie looked at the keys again. The wrong note was still fading away. It didn't matter. It was just a note. No one is watching, she told herself. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be. She realized that she was holding herself to a standard that nobody else cared about. She was so afraid of being bad that she wouldn't let herself be good. But perfection wasn't the point. The point was the feeling. The point was the connection. She took another deep breath. This time, she didn't think about the notes. She didn't think about the theory or the rhythm. She just thought about how she felt. She thought about the tiredness in her legs, the loneliness of her apartment, and the heavy weight of the dreams she carried. She put all of that feeling into her fingertips. She reached out and played a chord. A minor chord this time. Sad, but beautiful. Then, something strange happened. Her left hand found a rhythm on its own. It wasn't the simple beat of a child's song. It was a rolling pattern, low and steady. Boom chick, boom chick. Her right hand hovered, then began to pick out notes that weren't from a memory, but from her imagination. It was slow at first, halting, but then the notes began to flow together. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was a little awkward in places, but it was hers. It was a sound that no one had ever heard before because it came from her. Julie forgot about the restaurant. She forgot about her aching feet. She forgot about the uniform and the trays. In the dark, quiet dining room, with her hands on the keys, she was just a girl playing a piano. And for the first time in 6 years, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The sound that came out of the piano next wasn't just a chord. It was a voice. It was a deep, rich sound that seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards and up into Julie's legs. For a second, she was scared. She almost pulled her hands away and ran back to the safety of the kitchen. But the feeling that rushed through her was too strong. It felt like waking up after a long, deep sleep. Her fingers, which had felt stiff and rusty just a moment ago, suddenly remembered what to do. Her left hand began to move on its own. It found a low, steady rhythm on the bass notes. Thump, 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 thump. It was a heartbeat. It wasn't the perfect, polished rhythm of a metronome. It was slightly rough, a little bit human. It had a swagger to it. Then her right hand joined in. It didn't play a simple nursery rhyme this time. It began to weave a melody. It was sad but sweet, like a memory of a summer day that is ending. Julie closed her eyes tight. She blocked out the chandeliers. She blocked out the expensive art on the walls. She blocked out the fact that she was wearing a stained apron. In the darkness of her mind, she wasn't in a restaurant anymore. She was back in her old living room. She could smell the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. She could feel her father sitting next to her on the bench, his shoulder touching hers, nodding his head to the beat. The music grew louder. It swelled up like a wave rising in the ocean. The notes tumbled over each other, tumbling down the scales and then climbing back up, high and bright. The sound of the grand piano was incredible. It was so much bigger than the old upright she remembered. When she hit the lower keys, the sound was a growl, like a giant waking up. When she played the high keys, they rang out like crystal bells, clear and sharp. She played with a passion she didn't know she still had. She wasn't thinking about what note came next. Her hands were moving faster than her brain could process. It was like a dam had broken inside her. Years of silence, years of saying yes, sir, and right away, ma'am. Years of keeping her head down and her mouth shut, tall of that frustration and awe of that hidden joy poured out of her fingers. The melody became more complex. It wasn't just sad anymore. It was angry too. There were sharp staccato notes that sounded like arguments. There were crashing chords that sounded like storm clouds. Julie's fingers were flying now. She was sweating slightly, her breath coming in short gasps. But she didn't stop. It felt too good to stop. It felt like she was finally breathing for the first time in years. She didn't notice the change in the room at first. She was too lost in the music, but slowly the world around her began to react. At table 8, a man in a sharp gray suit was mid-sentence. He was complaining about the stock market to his wife. But as the music grew louder, his voice trailed off. He turned his head toward the center of the room. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He stopped chewing. Near the window, the young couple who had been giggling and looking at their phones went quiet. The girl looked up, her eyes wide. She nudged the boy with her elbow and pointed. They both turned to look at the piano. Even the staff noticed. Tom, the waiter who was always joking around, was standing by the service station holding a stack of napkins. He froze. He dropped the napkins on the counter without realizing it. He knew Julie. He knew she was a hard worker, a quiet girl who kept to herself. He had no idea she could play like that. He watched her, his mouth open slightly, completely stunned. In the corner, the busboys stopped laughing. They leaned on their brooms, mesmerized by the sound. They didn't know much about classical music or jazz. They just knew that this sounded real. It sounded like something important. The music filled every corner of the azure peak. It swallowed up the clinking of glasses. It drowned out the hum of the refrigerator. The piano, which had sat silent and lonely for so long, was singing at the top of its lungs. And Julie was the one making it sing. She hit a series of high, trilling notes that sounded like a bird taking flight. Then, she brought both hands down the keyboard in a cascading run of notes, ending with a deep, resonant chord in the bass. The sound hung in the air for a long time, vibrating against the walls. For that moment, Julie wasn't a waitress. She wasn't the invisible girl. She was the most important person in the room. Every pair of eyes was on her, but she didn't see them. She didn't see the admiration or the confusion on their faces. She only saw the music. She played a softer section now. The notes were gentle, like a lullaby. It was a melody she had made up in her head during long, lonely bus rides. She had never played it on real keys before. Hearing it now, coming from this beautiful instrument, made her heart ache. It was beautiful. It was actually truly beautiful. She poured her loneliness into the keys. She played for the nights she spent eating microwave dinners alone. She played for the mother she missed and the father who was gone. She played for the dreams she had packed away in boxes when she moved to the city. The music cried for her. It was a sound so pure and so full of emotion that it made the lady in the red, dressed near the front, wipe a tear from her eye. Julie's hands were moving with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Her fingers flew across the 88 keys, white and blurring black. She wasn't worried about hitting a wrong note anymore. If she hit a wrong note, it just became part of the song. It was jazz. It was life. It was messy and imperfect, but it was alive. The song was building again. It was climbing toward a climax. The rhythm got faster. Her left hand was pounding out the beat now, strong and steady. Her right hand was playing arpeggios that ran up the keyboard like a waterfall. The sound was huge. It was roaring. It felt like the piano was going to lift off the floor. The man in the gray suit at table 8 had put his fork down completely. He wasn't thinking about the stock market anymore. He was just listening, a look of wonder on his face. He hadn't heard music like this in a long time. Not in this restaurant, not in the concert hall. This had soul. It had grit. The room was completely still. The only movement was the swaying of the busboys to the rhythm and the intense motion of Julie's hands. The air seemed to crackle with electricity. It was one of those rare moments where time seems to stop, where everyone in the room is connected by the same feeling. Julie felt the energy of the room. Even if she didn't see the people, she could feel the silence changing. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of attention. It was full of people holding their breath. It gave her a rush of adrenaline that made her feel dizzy. She played louder, putting everything she had into the final stretch of the song. She was playing for her life. She was playing to prove to herself that she was still in there, somewhere underneath the uniform and the exhaustion. She was showing the world, and herself, that the girl who loved music hadn't disappeared. She was just waiting for her turn to speak. The melody soared one last time, high into the treble clef, ringing out like a bell in a church tower. Then, Julie brought her hands crashing down in a dramatic full-chord finish. She held her hands down on the keys, letting the sound blast through the room, letting it ring out and echo against the high ceiling. The vibration shook through the bench, through her body, through her bones, and then she lifted her hands. The silence rushed back in. But it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the empty, cold silence of before. It was a heavy, electric silence. The kind of silence that happens after something big has just changed. Julie sat there on the bench, her chest heaving up and down. Her hands were hovering in the air above the keys, trembling slightly. The sweat on her forehead was cold. Slowly, the sounds of the restaurant started to come back to her, the hum of the ice maker. The traffic from the street, but they sounded distant, like they were happening underwater. She opened her eyes. She was back in the Azure Peak. She was still wearing her apron. But the world looked different. She wasn't looking at her shoes. She was looking up. Then, from the table by the window, she heard a sound. It was the sound of someone clapping. Then another person joined in. Then another. The applause started slowly, hesitant at first, but then it grew. It wasn't polite clapping. It was real clapping. It was loud. It was the sound of people who had been moved by what they heard. It was the sound of the invisible girl finally being seen. The last note of the piano hung in the air like a heavy cloud, vibrating against the walls and the high ceiling before slowly fading away into nothing. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent. It was that kind of silence where you feel like you can hear your own heart beating in your ears. Julie sat on the bench, her hands still hovering over the keys. Her chest was rising and falling fast. Her fingers felt strange, hot and tingly, like they were waking up from a long sleep. She could feel the sweat on her forehead and the back of her neck. As the adrenaline started to wear off, reality came rushing back in. She looked down at her hands. They were the same hands that had carried heavy trays and scrubbed tables just 10 minutes ago. But they felt different now. They felt like they belonged to someone else. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence. Clap. Julie flinched like she had been pinched. She snapped her head up, her eyes wide. Her heart immediately dropped into her stomach. Panic seized her. She had done it. She had crossed the line. She had touched the expensive instrument, played loud noise, and disturbed the peace. She was going to be in so much trouble. She imagined Mr. Henderson storming out of his office, his face red, shouting that she was fired. She imagined the customers complaining that the help had made a scene. She quickly pulled her hands away from the keyboard and clutched them against her chest, shrinking back on the bench. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to run out the service exit and never come back. But as she looked around, the room did not look angry. The man in the gray suit at table 8 was lowering his hands. He had started the clapping. Now, a smile was spreading across his face, a genuine look of delight. He nodded at her, a slow, respectful nod. Then, the couple near the window started to clap. The young woman was beaming, her eyes shining. She wasn't looking at Julie like she was a waitress. She was looking at her like she was a star. The applause began to spread. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was strong. It filled the room. From the corner of her eye, Julie saw the kitchen doors swing open. Tom, the waiter, and 2 of the busboys stepped out, leaving their work behind. They were leaning against the doorframe, clapping and whistling. Even the cooks in the white hats were peeking through the small round window in the kitchen doors. Grinning and giving her a thumbs dash up, Julie sat there frozen. Her face felt hot. She didn't know what to do. This wasn't supposed to happen. Waitresses didn't get standing ovations. Invisible girls didn't get recognized. Mr. Henderson, the manager, walked out from his office. Julie held her breath, waiting for the shouting. He buttoned his jacket as he walked, looking serious. He walked right up to the piano. Julie's heart hammered against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the words, "You're fired." "Julie," Mr. Henderson said. His voice wasn't angry. It was soft. Julie opened one eye. "I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to. I know I'm not supposed to." Mr. Henderson held up a hand to stop her. He looked at the customers, who were still clapping, and then he looked back at her. "How long have you been able to play like that?" "Since I was a little girl," Julie whispered, clutching the fabric of her skirt. "But it's been a long time." "You hit it well," Mr. Henderson said. He smoothed his tie. "We have had many musicians play in this restaurant, some of them very famous. But none of them have ever made the room go this quiet." He paused, looking at the people who were still watching her. "I think table 8 wants an encore." Julie blinked. "An encore?" The man in the gray suit stood up. "Yes, please," he called out from across the room. "Play one more. We insist." "I second that," the woman by the window added. The whole room seemed to be waiting. The energy had shifted completely. The invisible wall between the staff and the customers, between the worker and the diner, had been shattered by the music. They weren't just looking at a server anymore. They were listening to an artist. Julie looked at the keyboard. The fear was still there, hiding in the back of her mind. She was worried her fingers would freeze again. She was worried she would make a mistake and ruin the moment. But as she looked at the keys, she realized she didn't have a choice. The music wasn't done with her yet. She took a deep, shaky breath and placed her hands back on the ivory keys. The moment her skin touched the cool surface, the trembling stopped. The piano felt like a friend again. She didn't play another complicated, fast song. She played something gentle. It was a simple melody full of longing and peace. It was a song that felt like saying goodbye to the old Julie and hello to whoever she was becoming as the notes floated out. The restaurant went back to that magical hush. But this time, Julie wasn't playing in the dark. She lifted her head. She looked out into the room. She made eye contact with the couple near the window. She saw the man in the gray suit close his eyes and listen. She saw Tom leaning against the doorframe with a look of pride on his face. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't looking at the floor. She wasn't trying to be small. She was taking up space. She was filling the room with her voice, even though she wasn't speaking a word. The song was shorter, but it felt more important. Every note was a thank you. It was a thank you to the piano for waiting for her. It was a thank you to her father for teaching her to be brave. And it was a thank you to herself for not walking away when she was scared. When she played the final chord, she held her hands high, letting the sound ring out clearly and proudly. She didn't shrink away this time. She sat up straight, her shoulders back. The applause was instant and louder than before. This time, the man in the gray suit actually raised his glass in a toast to her. "To the pianist," he said loudly. "To real music?" Julie stood up from the bench. Her legs felt a little wobbly, like she had just run a long race. She smoothed her apron and looked around the room. The spell of the music was fading, but the feeling remained. Mr. Henderson walked up to her. He didn't look angry. He looked impressed. "Julie," he said, "we are going to need to talk about the schedule. I think we can find a spot for you on stage on Friday nights." Julie couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face. It wasn't just a polite customer service smile. It was a real, deep smile that reached her eyes. "I would like that," she said. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen to get back to work. But the walk felt different. Her stride was longer. Her head was high. As she passed the tables, people stopped her. "That was beautiful." "Honey," an older lady whispered, touching Julie's arm lightly. "You have a gift," said another man. Looking up from his steak, Julie nodded and thanked them, but she didn't say too much. She didn't need to. She knew the truth now. She pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The noise of the pots and the shouting chefs hit her ears again. It was hot and chaotic, but it didn't feel suffocating anymore. It just felt like a kitchen. Tom was standing there, grinning from ear to ear. He grabbed a towel and snapped it at her playfully. "So, that's what you do on your break?" "Play concertos," he teased. "You've been holding out on us, Julie." The other cooks cheered for her as she walked by. "Bravo, bravo." Julie laughed. It was a sound she hadn't made in a long time. "I guess I was just waiting for the right piano," she said. She walked over to the sink to wash her hands. She looked at her reflection in the shiny metal surface of the refrigerator. She saw the same uniform. She saw the same hair pulled back in a bun, but the girl in the reflection was different. Her eyes were bright. Her face was glowing. She wasn't invisible anymore. She knew that tomorrow she would still have to serve food. She would still have to pay rent. The world hadn't magically become perfect. But something inside her had changed. She had reclaimed a piece of herself that she thought was lost forever. She had touched the piano, and the piano had touched her back. She dried her hands on a rough towel, took a deep breath of the steamy, garlic-scented air, and walked back out into the dining room. This time, she didn't look down at her feet. She looked straight ahead. She walked past the grand piano, giving its glossy black side a gentle pat with her hand as she passed by. "Thank you," she whispered to the instrument. And for the first time, she felt like the star of her own life.